Hello, friends. This is my first attempt at a class here. We're going to be covering one of my favorite topics, which is biblical backgrounds. And so we're going to go through this. We'll cover in a matter of a few weeks the background for the Old Testament as well as the background for the New Testament. But we're going to start out with just some kind of conceptual background and why do we even do this? Why do we even do this kind of background study? Why is it necessary? How is it useful? That sort of thing. So, to start with, historically speaking, this isn't something that's always been done with biblical interpretation. And so there's this concept of Babel and Bibel. That's how it was in German. That's kind of where it started in Germany. And the controversial claim coming out of that German biblical scholarship was that the Bible was dependent on other A&E material. A&E here means ancient Near Eastern. And this is material from in and around the Levant, the area of Israel and Iraq and Syria, etc. Um, so the claim was that the Bible was dependent on material like, Gilgamesh. Uh, Probably familiar with other things like the Enuma Elish and things like that. And the conclusion deriving from this, then, at least in this earlier scholarship, was that as a result, the Bible was human and not divine. And so that's where this becomes controversial, really. The controversy wasn't necessarily the dependence on A&E material. The controversy was when the conclusion was drawn from that the Bible was human and not divine. And so what this does is it creates a divide in scholarship between secular or scientific and confessional. Confessional meaning someone who has some sort of uh, confessional skin in the game, religious skin in the game, right? A Jewish scholar, or a Christian scholar, or Muslim scholar, or anybody whose religion stands to gain or lose based on your conclusion. And then you have the scientific and secular scholar who ostensibly at least has no skin in the game. Now, there's problems with this, obviously, because, a lot of times people will say a confessional scholar can't do honest scholarship. In reality, nobody can do honest scholarship. We're all biased. We all have skin in the game. We all have a dog in the fight, regardless of what that is. And so that's complicating the situation for all of us. But for quite some time, what emerges here is this idea that if you're a confessional scholar, you're not really a scholar. You really are only a scholar if you're secular, or you can put your faith on the side and kind of hold it outside of your scholarship. And so that kind of emerges in 19th century German scholarship. And the outcome over the years since then has mostly been that all of the original claims, or at least most of them, have been rejected. They just don't hold up over time. Um, but what is held out is this comparison of, if the Bible is dependent on other material or it interacts with other material, what do we do with that? What do we do with its interactions with this other material? Well, this quote I think helps us contextualize that. It says that the Bible bears an unmistakable human stamp does not lead to the necessary conclusion that it is merely the words of humans rather than the Word of God. How else would you have expected God to speak in ways wholly disconnected to the ancient world? Who would have understood him? When God speaks, he speaks in ways that we would understand. And this is from a book called Inspiration and Incarnation by Pete Enns, which I will talk about in a minute. But for now, I just want you to think about this quote and what he's getting at here. When God speaks to someone in the scriptures, we should expect that he's speaking to that person in a way that that person can understand him. Now, we can look back on that and understand it, but it wasn't written to us. This is a distinction that John Walton makes in his scholarship, which is that the Bible is for us and not to us. And so when God's speaking to someone, he's speaking to them, and for God's people throughout history. If you hear that click clack in the background, that's my dog walking around. So, uh, but so that's what Ends is getting at here, is that we should expect that God is speaking in terms that the people he's originally speaking to will be able to understand, and that shouldn't be controversial, but it is. Um, this book, Inspiration and Incarnation by Pete Enns, is very controversial book. And we're not going to get into tons of the controversy here. But basically, Enns in this book is trying to bridge a gap between conservatives and liberals, trying to bridge that confessional secular divide, so to speak. Conservatives, broadly speaking, it's a generalization here, but conservatives didn't like that. And, huge generalization here. But as a result, Enns ends up getting fired from his position at Westminster Theological Seminary. Since that backlash, Enns has drifted quite a bit towards the liberal end of the spectrum. There's plenty of things to be said about that, whether maybe he was already kind of leaning that direction, or I've heard people say, well, he wasn't really a Christian to begin with, and we really shouldn't try to judge someone's heart when it comes to this kind of stuff. That's yeah. What I think is most telling here is, if we compare Enns's experience with the experience of Michael Licona, we have a similar initial event where someone writes something and controversy is stirred and it leads to them losing a position. Well, Licona has a bunch of people that kind of rally around him, and since has more or less stuck with evangelicalism, broadly speaking. Enns did not have, as far as I understand it, a community rallying around him, and that may have contributed, I think, to his drift. Now I'm not personal friends with Enns or Licona, and so I could have the details of this wrong. You know, take that for what it's worth. But I do think it's a cautionary tale for us with regard to community and how we treat people. How we treat people that are going through a difficult time. So. Anyway, if you want to follow up with Enns, he's got some great stuff to say, regardless of whether you agree with him on some of his more liberal positions. He's still a good scholar and really intelligent person, and his podcast is fantastic. It's called The Bible for Normal People. Now, again, having said that he's a bit on the liberal side of things, there's going to be some things you disagree with, but it's still a great podcast to check out. Yeah, it's a great thing to take a look at. Another book in this realm that's worth looking at, and really anything about this author would work, but specifically The Bible Unfiltered by Mike Heiser. This is a bit less controversial, but Heiser is still somewhat a controversial figure. I think he probably goes a bit too far. Sometimes it seems like, I mentioned John Walton before. John Walton's another figure that is great on this topic, though he might be a little bit harder to understand at a kind of a lay level. Heiser here, Bible Unfiltered, that's something that pretty much anybody could read. Walton, I think the difference between Walton and Heiser is that Walton is saying this is what the original culture believed, and this is how it helps us understand the text. I think Heiser takes it a step further to say what the original culture was thinking and believing is correct. And so you take the Divine Council, for instance, something that both of them will talk about. Walton talks about it as a cultural concept that helps us understand Scripture. Heiser talks about it as a reality. And so I think that would be the difference between the two of them. I think Heiser maybe goes a little bit too far. But one of the reasons this book is so easy to understand is it's basically a collection of blog posts. And so, 2 to 3 pages for a chapter, and so it's super easy to follow. Unfortunately, Heiser passed away somewhat recently, but you can find his podcast at The Naked Bible, and he's written a ton of other works in and around this field, and so it's definitely worth time to check out and see his opinion on things, and even if it's just to be challenged, he's a great figure to listen to. Moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament, Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity by David DaSilva. This is probably, if there's one book you're going to read on interpreting the New Testament, this would be the one. It is occasionally difficult because it is an academic work, but pushing through it is well worth it. Going through these 4 values of honor, patronage, kinship, and purity, and looking at how they impact how we understand the New Testament it's just hugely valuable. It's hard to overstate how valuable these concepts are, and that's something that we will go through in later videos. We'll unpack those individually. But speaking of, DaSilva does have a lot of these videos on YouTube, and I'll link to those in the comments below, or in the description below, rather. And so he's got videos that go through a lot of these things, and then specifically unpack specific passages and how the concept relates to that passage. And so it's fantastic. So what we're doing here with background and comparative studies, these are the 2 steps kind of that we're going to be taking. This course, including the textbooks that I just mentioned, that if you want to read along with the videos, you're welcome to. This assumes that the culture of the recipients of the Bible, that culture impacts how the message was delivered to them. So comparing biblical data with cultural data is helpful. This is done through these 2 steps of background studies and comparative studies. So background studies are sometimes called cultural studies. This examines literature and archaeology in order to reconstruct the behavior, beliefs, cultures, values, and the worldview of the people in question. And so this is really just good history, right? Good historical research. And so an example of this would be studying the Babylonian creation account, the Enuma Elish. It's just primary source material that we're trying to get at, original audience, trying to figure out who are the Babylonians, what are they like, who are the Egyptians, what are they like, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's background studies. Comparative studies, as you might imagine, based on the word comparative, this is a branch of cultural studies that attempts to draw data from different segments of the broader culture in a relationship with each other, in order to assess what can be learned from one and enhance the understanding of another. This is Walton's definition from his excellent book on this topic. The A&E Thought in the Old Testament is the name of the book. An example of this would be recognizing similarities between characters and themes in the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 and 2. So, for instance, there's a relationship or potential relationship between to whom, which is that word there that you can see there in Hebrew. That's to whom. This is deep in just chapter 1. And so there's to whom and Tiamat. And so there's a phonetic similarity between to whom and Tiamat. And so there's an arguable chance that in writing, darkness was over the face of the deep, that in using to whom there, that it's saying that darkness was over the face of Tiamat. Tiamat's a creator deity in the Enuma Elish, and so then, the message here would be something like the one who's creating in the Babylonian story, their face is covered in darkness in the Hebrew story, right? They're ignorant of what's going on, so to speak. And so that's one potential way of looking at that sort of comparison. Now, it's possible that that's not what the author has in mind and using to whom. There's no guarantee there, but we have to do the work in order to figure out what our options are, right? So that's just one example. So why do we need comparative studies? Why even do this? If you think about just basic communication, it requires a body of agreed upon words, terms, and ideas. Anytime we communicate, the example that I tend to use is, if I were to say, for our purposes, my trash can, we're going to refer to my trash can as my dog, right? Well, if I were to ask you to take my dog for a walk, well, then that would mean contextually that I want you to take the trash out, right? If I ask you to feed my dog, then that means I want you to put something in the trash, right? But that's only specifically in the context where I'm saying I'm referring to the trash can as my dog. Now, on the other hand, I've got a dog right here laying on the floor beside me. And I could mean something completely different. I could mean that I want you to take Ahsoka out for a walk, or I want you to put some food in her dish, And so it depends on the cognitive environment. This is what John Walton calls the cognitive environment, what we share, right? Are you a part of a community that shares the understanding of I'm going to refer to the trash can as a dog, right? And if you're not, then either I'm a bad communicator by assuming that, or you would expect that I'm not going to just use that phrase, right? And so when we understand this sort of cognitive environment, we realize that there are things that they understood that don't need to be written, that don't need to be explicitly stated, that the audience would have just sort of picked up on. So an example of this in 1 Kings 18, I think, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Elijah is in this sort of prophet battle, right? And they're cutting themselves and screaming and doing all these things, right? This is the kind of environment where the people reading this would have familiarity with the Baal cycle. They would have familiarity with Baal worship. They would have familiarity with that religion in general. And so the author doesn't need to lay all of that out. The author doesn't need to explain, like, here's what we're talking about. Baal's a storm god. He doesn't need to tell anybody that because the audience knows it. And so right after that, when Elijah is trying to hear the voice of God, and there's a storm and there's wind and there's rain and all of these things, and the text says the Lord was not in them. That is juxtaposing God speaking, Yahweh speaking, with how Baal would speak, because Baal's a storm god, right? So the storm is something that would happen that his followers would then need to interpret. And the text is saying Yahweh doesn't do that. Yahweh doesn't give you a sign that you have to interpret. This is the importance of in the passage where it says that God speaks to Elijah in a still small voice. Well, there's debate about whether or not that's how that ought to be translated, but that's a story for another time. The point of the text is that God is speaking in a voice and not in signs to interpret, right? That is a huge difference textually. Like when we think about this in the cultural context, someone reading this who understands who Baal is and understands how the Baal cult works, Baal is speaking through a storm that is a sign that you have to interpret. In contrast to that, Yahweh is speaking through a voice that you understand. It's a big difference. Another thing would be development of theology. The Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. We have, this is something that Walton has done a ton of work on. If I remember correctly, he did his dissertation on Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. But in the Tower of Babel, explicitly states for us that the people are trying to build a name for themselves. And so that's what they're trying to accomplish, trying to build a name for themselves. In chapter 12, we're introduced to Abraham, and Abraham is going to be given a great name. So we have this juxtaposition of how humanity is trying to build their reputation, which is very honor centric, going back to those values we were talking about before, very honor centric. How they're going to build their reputation, and they're going to build their name. And then Abraham, who is going to be given a name, right? Also, the Tower of Babel is likely a ziggurat. And ziggurat, if you look up image of Ur of the Chaldees, actually I think I have this in another lecture, so I'll show that to you there. You can see a picture of a ziggurat still exists in Ur in Iraq. And the existence of these ziggurats, the purpose of them in their religion was not for people to get to heaven. That's one of the things that when we read Tower of Babel, people often think like they're building a tower so they can get to heaven, so they can ascend into heaven. Actually, what a ziggurat's doing is that it's providing a location for the deity to come down from heaven. And so what they're doing in the Tower of Babel is they're trying to build something so that they can manipulate God's blessing to come down to them. And that's the sharp contrast between the Tower of Babel and Abraham, is they're trying to build a name for themselves. They're trying to put themselves in a position where they can force God's blessing to come to them. And in sharp contrast with that, in Genesis 12, Abraham is freely given that blessing. He's given a great name from Yahweh. That's a free gift, right? So there's similarity and difference there. And that's really the big thing that we have to do here with this comparative study is what's the same and what's different. Because there's going to be similarities, and those are important, but there's going to be differences, right? And it's important to note, going back to the Babylon Bibel, right? Babel and Bible, similarities don't necessarily mean borrowing. And so just because there's similarities doesn't mean that Israel is just stealing wholesale from another culture, right? It could just mean that that's just what's in the water, right? Like that's just what's in the air. That's how everybody sees things, right? They're not necessarily stealing or borrowing. Elements need to be considered in their own context before there's a comparison that's been that we're going to make. Closeness in time, geography, and cultural contact increase the possibility of influence. If we're looking at some cultural concept from the Romans and we're trying to impose that on the Exodus, it's a hard argument to make. It's cultural concepts from Rome are probably not impacting the writing and passing down of the story of the Exodus. Okay, but since the Exodus has an awful lot to do with Egypt, Egyptian concepts probably do have a lot more to say about what's going on in the Exodus. Channels of transmission and genre affect whether some idea or practice should be considered as borrowed, and even borrowed elements can be transformed. This is, with Elijah, right? This is, a God speaking. We could say that's borrowed, right? But the way that God speaks is transformed. It's a sharp difference from how Baal is speaking. And then we have to remember that no culture is monolithic. So any culture that we're looking at, Old Testament, New Testament, whatever, we can't just say, well, Jews of that time thought this way, right? Or Assyrians of that time thought this way. Think about, to put that into modern parlance, Americans of today think this way. Is there anything that we can say that all Americans agree? That just no culture is monolithic. There's going to be diversity. There's going to be disagreement. Okay, and we need to leave room for that. Okay, so getting back to the scriptures, when we're thinking about this, we're tempted, and the way that we tend to do, devotional reading and stuff like that is we read uh, the scriptures and we think God speaks to me through his word. That's sort of the popular view of Revelation. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm not trying to tell you not to do your devos. I'm not trying to tell you that God can't speak to you through the Bible, right? I'm not trying to tell you any of those things. What I'm telling you is that there are extra steps that we can add in that will help us think through the more complicated texts. Right? There's this thing that I mentioned in one of my other videos called the perspicuity of Scripture, which is an idea from the Reformation, which is that the Scriptures are clear. We can understand the Scriptures, and that is true. We can pick up the Bible in a language that we understand, we can read it, and we can understand the Scriptures. But there are passages that are very difficult to understand. We're going to talk about some of those in future videos. There are passages that are just really difficult. And this background in comparative studies, this approach to things is going to help us with a lot of those passages. It's just super helpful to kind of back up and say, God speaks through the authors to their original audience and then to me. So if I understand who the authors were, if I understand who the original audience was, then I'll have a better chance of understanding what God was saying to them and what God is saying to me. So one of the ways we can conceptualize this is if we think about the biblical author and the current reader. The biblical author is separated from us chronologically. They are not writing at the same time as us. They're separated from us culturally. They have different values and different relationships. We're going to see a lot of differences in the values around honor, specifically, in one of our upcoming videos. There's also geographical distance. They're not writing from southwestern Virginia in America. In my instance, right? I'm in Radford, Virginia. There's linguistic difference. They're not writing in English. They're writing in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And then there's philosophical distance. Their approach to what is true, good, and beautiful is not the same, generally speaking, as the way that we approach those same things. Okay. And so this is all sort of the intro to background and comparative studies. I'll lay out in the next video how to do observations on a text, how to just observe the text, basically just a real simple approach to biblical interpretation, so that as we go through these videos, you have a better understanding of how we want to engage the text. And then I'll start getting into more specific cultural concepts, like who were the Egyptians and how does that impact the text? Who were the Assyrians and how does that impact the text, etc. And so if you have any questions or any thoughts or suggestions, feel free to let me know. Until next time, keep striving towards becoming an elephant.